Farewell to Manzanar by Jean Wakatsuki Houston and James D. Houston. On December 7th in the 1940s, a Japanese family had settled in Terminal Island. The father of this family was Ko. He worked on his boat called the Nereid with his oldest son Woody and Bill. Ko was very hard-headed and loved to be called skipper when he was on his boat. At the wharf was Woody's wife Chizu, Bill's wife, Ko's wife, and his daughter Jean. There they would wave them goodbye and wish them luck, just like the wives that lived there. They would watch them until they disappeared into the horizon. This time, the sailors immediately came back. At first, everyone was confused. Then, a man started shouting that the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. At the time, they didn't know what Pearl Harbor was, especially Jean. She was only a little girl. That night, Jean's father burned any contact he had with the Japanese. Unfortunately, his efforts were futile. 2 weeks later, the FBI came in and arrested him. They accused him of delivering oil to the Japanese submarines. He was imprisoned in Fort Lincoln. Later on, Jean's family had to move away from Terminal Island. The American Friends Service helped them find a small house in Boise Heights in downtown Los Angeles. There were a few hundred Terminal Island refugees living there. It was hard to adapt to their new surroundings since Jean's dad was gone. He was the leader of the family and always made the decisions for them. Then, Kyo, Jean, and Jean's sister May enrolled into a new school. Their teacher wasn't like their old teacher at Ocean Heights. At Ocean Heights, her teacher was kind, helpful, and supportive. At Boise Heights, her teacher was very remote and didn't help Jean and her family at all. That was the first sign to them that they were no longer wanted by the Caucasians. As time went by, the government forced all Japanese people to move to Manzanar, including the Wakatsuki family. At the time, there were rumors going around that people were destroying Japanese homes, so it was a relief to be out of the city. To prepare for the trip, Jean's mom bought coats. He grew up in Washington, and she knew that in early April it would be cold. They tied numbered tags to their duffel bags and collars. Those numbers were their official destination. Their strategy was to get everyone in the same district and have the same family number, even though the last names were changed after marriage. Luckily, Woody and Jean's mom succeeded in getting everyone together, but some families weren't as lucky. Then they took a bus to Manzanar. On the bus, people tried to pass the time by playing cards or by reading a magazine. They arrived in Manzanar in the late afternoon. Inside the camp were barracks that they would live in. They came just in time for dinner. Outside the mess halls was a long line that went around a half-finished building. They served them canned sausage, canned string beans, and overcooked steamed rice with a topping of apricots. At the time, the Caucasians thought that rice with apricots was a good dessert. For the Japanese, rice is never served with sweet foods, only with salty or savory foods. After dinner, the Wakatsuki family were taken to Block 16, where they would live for the time being. Each barrack was 16 by 20 feet, with only one light bulb dangling from the ceiling, and an oil stove that served them as a heater. They gave them army cots, 2 brown army blankets each, and a mattress cover. At night, Jean's mom had to pile their clothes on top of each other to keep warm. Woody and the rest of the family tried to fill up the cracks to help. They used tin cans to cover the holes in the floor and rolled paper to stuff the doorframe. There was nothing more they can do. After all, they didn't have much supplies to work with. As they settled in, Jean was allowed to go out more. She met many people, including 2 women in black robes. Their names was Sister Mary Susan and Sister Mary Bernadette. They were married lonely nuns that go into the country to convert people to Catholicism. They created Children's Village and turned one of the barracks into a church. A priest named Father Steinbach joined them to help them convert people. They told Jean stories about the saints and martyrs that died for their religion. After a few months, Jean's dad finally came back to the family, but he wasn't the same. Everyone came down to meet him except Chizu. She gave birth to her first grandson and named him George in honor of Ko's return. He was gone for 9 months. When he arrived, no one approached him at first. Then Jean ran up to him and hugged him. At this point, everyone was crying. They all missed him so much. He forced his wife to bring him extra rice or fruit syrup. He would use these ingredients to make his own rice wine or apricot brandy. He would drink these until he was drunk and passed out. In the morning, he would be groaning, but he would still drink his brews. When his wife would try to comfort him, he would threaten her and abuse her. As time passed, the people at Manzanar began to start meetings in the mess hall to discuss what they wanted. They wanted higher wages, better food, patriotism, and much more. Some meetings became shouting sessions, which eventually led to fistfights. One group planned to burn down the general store, but failed. They also tried to assassinate people. In December, Fred Tayama, a leader of the Japanese American Citizens League, was beaten by 6 men and was sent to the camp hospital for recovery. The next day, 3 men were arrested. One of them went to jail. In February, the government's loyal oath came. All men 17 and over must serve in the army. Woody eventually had to go, but his father wouldn't let him. After 5 months of isolation, Ko was forced to speak to his son, Woody, about the situation. If Woody said yes, he would be drafted. If he said no, he would be shipped to Japan. After a long conversation of his father ranting and him listening quietly, they both knew that Woody would have to leave whether they liked it or not. In 1943, they were able to move to Block 28. Jean's mom heard that the people who lived in one of the barracks in Block 28 moved out and immediately got the spot. It's near the camp hospital and the pear orchids. Jean's dad would still brew his concoctions, but he went outside more often. He cared for those trees. They built a root cellar to store the fruit. Their new home had 4 rooms and a new ceiling. Later on, Ko began to carve furniture out of driftwood. He would even make a rock garden outside the doorway. Soon, everyone was making rock gardens. He also painted scenery with watercolors. He loved to paint the mountains, such as Mount Whitney. After settling in Block 28, a new school was built. Before, the teachers were volunteers, the classes were scattered across the camp, and the equipment wasn't good. This new school had new blackboards, desks, reference books, and lab supplies. On top of school, Jean attended many classes. The first one she tried was baton twirling. Instead of a baton, she used a broomstick with a tennis ball on it. Eventually, her mom bought her a baton from Sears. Her teacher, Nancy, was a great baton twirler and taught her students all of her tricks. Jean joined the baton club at school and entered many contests. She tried out many activities, but this one interested her the most. Later on, Jean's older sister, Eleanor, was planning to go to Reno, Nevada, where her husband was. Instead, she was in the hospital giving birth to a baby that was supposed to be born in Reno. A few months later, her husband was drafted. Eleanor couldn't go to Reno and she couldn't go with him to the Army training base. When she went to the hospital, everyone was worried. 2 of her family members gave birth there too. One of them might have died if Woody didn't provide blood. The other lied in bed and bled to death. Then, all of a sudden, Jean's mom rushed out of the hospital. This worried Ko and Jean. They thought something terrible had happened to Eleanor too. Breathless, Jean's mom told them that it was a boy and that they were both fine. They both hugged each other and cried out of happiness and relief. At the end of 1944, many families left Manzanar, and only about 6,000 people were made. Eleanor and her family were the first to leave. After having a baby, she moved back to Reno to stay with her friends. Then Woody left. He waited for the army to draft him, and in August they did. People eventually began to ask the question, will we stay in Manzanar after the war? A student from the University of Washington began to look for answers. He challenged the evacuation order but failed. Others tried as well. Then Mitsu Endo, a 21-year-old employee of California State Highway Commission, convinced the government that they can't hold citizens against their will. Next, the camps that they were in were now being shut down, and the people will be returning to their former homes. Sadly, the Katsukis had no home to return to. They were afraid that something terrible would happen to them. People have been posting racist headlines, hate slogans, and much more. Eventually, the Wakatsukis decided to leave Manzanar. Ko walked to Lone Park to buy a car. His wife tried to talk him out of it, but he insisted on getting a car instead of taking the bus. He came back with a blue Nash sedan. They tied the double mattress onto the roof and stuffed most of their furniture in the back seats, where Jean, her mom, and her sister May sat. It took 4 days to get back. The car would always break down every 100 miles, and they also had to make 4 trips to get their clothes, furniture, and family together. After they arrived, the American Friends Service helped them rent a house in Cabrillo Homes. It had 3 bedrooms, an inside toilet, and a kitchen with a stove. Jean's mom got silverware from the neighbors that she left it with. The warehouse she stored the rest of the furniture was robbed. As Jean grew up, she was treated differently from her classmates. They thought that she couldn't speak English, but she could. Eventually, she began to fit in. She did many things such as winning Carnival Queen and performing in front of the town. Unfortunately, some people still treat her differently. Jean later got married to James D. Houston and had kids. Eventually, she decided to make one last trip to Manzanar. She saw the torn-down buildings, the old pear orchids, and the small rock gardens. This place used to be her home, but now she has a nice family to be with.